Have you ever wondered what you'd do if you found 3 kids abandoned in the rain, with no one to care for them? This is the story of a cop who, despite his own grief and pain, chooses to change the fate of those children. He didn't know it yet, but that unexpected encounter would change all their lives forever. Stay tuned for more stories like this, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. William drove slowly through the rain-soaked streets of the small town. The patrol car's windshield wipers struggled, failing to keep the furious rain at bay in his world. His gaze was lost, almost automatic, scanning the dark corners of the alleys. His work was his only escape, his only distraction from the pain that consumed him since the death of his son. Months had passed, but the void felt as raw as the first day. Lauren Kant, his wife, had not emerged from her grief. She was trapped in a bottomless pit of sorrow, and he, no matter how hard he tried, couldn't reach her. The weight of his uniform felt heavier with each passing day. Once, wearing it filled him with pride, a reason to get up every morning. Now it was just an empty armor, a duty he clung to like a castaway to a plank in a turbulent ocean. The sound of the radio interrupted his thoughts, but he barely paid attention. Patrolling the town on a rainy afternoon was usually a quiet task, without major surprises, but nothing in his life had been calm lately. His home was a place of deafening silence. Lauren didn't speak, barely ate, and every time he tried to get close, he felt something invisible pushing him away, leaving him even more alone. A flash of lightning lit up the street, and for a brief moment, he saw a silhouette on the sidewalk. At first, he thought it was an illusion caused by the storm's glare, but when he looked again, the figure was still there. A small boy, soaked from head to toe, was holding something in his arms. William stopped the car and quickly got out. As he approached, the boy looked up, and William felt a knot in his stomach. There was something in those eyes that reminded him of his own son, a look of innocence mixed with a deep sadness that shouldn't be in the eyes of a child that age. The boy was about 8, but what really struck him were the 2 babies he held, one in each arm. All 3 were drenched, shivering, their faces marked by the cold. William crouched down slowly, trying not to scare them. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, though his voice trembled more than he would have liked. The boy didn't respond immediately. He looked at him with a mix of distrust and exhaustion, as if he had been in this state of vulnerability for far too long. William repeated the question, but this time his tone was firmer, the tone of someone who knows that something is terribly wrong. "I don't know what to do," the boy finally whispered. His voice was barely a murmur, as if he feared that speaking louder could make things worse. William looked at the babies in his arms. They were twins, so small they seemed barely born. The rain continued to fall on them, soaking them. But what worried him most was the expression of exhaustion on the older boy's face. He looked like he had been carrying those babies for a long time, longer than his small body could handle. "Where are your parents?" William asked, although he already dreaded the answer. "I don't have parents," the boy said, his eyes glassy. William felt a sharp pain in his heart. The story was too familiar, the pain too close. He wanted to scream, to do something to change the fate of those children, but he held back. Instead, he took out his radio and called for assistance, although in his mind, he already knew he was getting involved in a way that would change his life forever. He carefully took the babies, one in each arm, freeing the boy from the burden he seemed to have been carrying for hours. The little ones were incredibly light, but also cold to the touch, which quickened his sense of urgency. "Come on, I'll take you to a safe place," he said, leading the boy toward his car. The boy followed without protest. His body was exhausted, his legs trembling, but it wasn't just the cold that weakened him. It was something deeper, a loneliness that William understood all too well. As he settled them into the back seat, something inside him broke. Seeing those children in such a situation pulled him back to the hospital room where his son had spent his last days. The helplessness, the fear, the desperation, it all returned in a wave that nearly drowned him. He couldn't lose those children too. He couldn't let the world steal their future as it had done with his son. He drove toward the police station, the rain pounding on the car like a macabre rhythm accompanying his thoughts. The boy, sitting in silence beside him, stared out the window, but William could see he was somewhere else, trapped in his own memories, just as he was. When they arrived, he carried the babies inside, where a duty officer hurried to help them. The boy remained clinging to the edge of William's jacket, not wanting to let go. William didn't blame him. The world had been cruel to both of them. The police station was quieter than usual that afternoon. While William's colleagues tried to settle the three children and took care of the urgent matters, he couldn't shake off the image of what he had just witnessed. The little ones seemed more than just abandoned. The state in which he had found them continued to haunt him. After making sure the babies were safe, he approached the older boy, Michael, who was sitting in a corner, wrapped in a blanket that still couldn't stop his body from shaking. William crouched down beside him, looking him in the eye, but trying not to be too abrupt. "Michael, I need you to help me understand," William said with the gentlest voice he could muster. "How did you end up here? Where were you before?" The boy didn't look at him right away. His eyes were still glued to the floor, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on his small shoulders. After a few seconds, Michael finally lifted his gaze. "A woman. She brought us here," he said in a whisper. William leaned in a bit more, trying to catch every word. "Who was that woman? Where did you come from?" Michael clutched the blanket around his body, as if he needed a barrier between himself and the pain of his memories. He took a deep breath, as if it was hard for him to find the right words. "She was from the orphanage. She left us here and went away without looking back," he said, his voice heavy with a sadness no child should know. William felt something twist inside him. The story didn't add up. An orphanage wouldn't just leave three children out on the street in the rain, especially in those conditions. The babies were clearly neglected, and Michael showed signs of a much deeper trauma than he wanted to admit. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. "How long had you been in that orphanage?" William asked, trying to connect the dots. Michael looked down again, hesitating. "I don't know. A long time. But it's not a good place," he murmured, almost inaudible. The child's response confirmed what William had already feared. There was something dark happening in that place, and those kids were at the center of it. The police officer tried to hide his concern, but his mind was already processing what he had just heard. He needed to find out more about that orphanage, about the people in charge. He couldn't ignore what those children had endured. "I promise I won't let anything bad happen to you," William said, gently touching Michael's shoulder. "We're going to find the truth." The words echoed in his mind like a vow, not just to Michael, but to himself as well. He had lost his son, but he wasn't going to let fate snatch these children away too. After ensuring that the children were well cared for, William briefly said goodbye to his colleagues at the station and decided it was time to head home, but not alone. He would take Michael and the babies with him. His colleagues warned him of the risks, but they didn't stop him. Due to the rain that day, the roads were closed and the city was engulfed in chaos. It was unlikely that social services would reach the precinct that day. William's mind remained focused on the orphanage. As he drove through the dark, wet streets, an idea began to form. He had to investigate that place, not just for the three children, but because something told him the situation was much graver than it appeared at first glance. He arrived home shortly after the storm began to ease. The facade of his home was the same as always, but the atmosphere inside was thick, weighed down by an unyielding sadness. Lauren, his wife, had been trapped in her own grief since the death of their son. She rarely left her room. William didn't know if the presence of these three children would help or worsen the situation, but he had no other choice. He needed a safe place for them, and his home was the only refuge he could offer at that moment. He entered carefully, carrying the two babies while Michael followed closely, taking slow, cautious steps. The house was silent, as always. Only the sound of their footsteps and the faint creaking of the floor broke the stillness. William headed toward Lauren's room, with the children in his arms, knowing he had to prepare for any reaction. When he opened the door, he found her just as he had left her that morning, sitting on the bed, staring out the window, but with her gaze lost somewhere only she could see. Grief had ensnared her since their son's death, and William didn't know how to help her. "Lauren," he said softly, so as not to startle her. She didn't respond immediately, but after a moment, her eyes slowly turned toward him. At first, she seemed not to notice what he was carrying. But then, her gaze landed on the babies. William held his breath, waiting for some kind of reaction. He knew it would bring back painful memories, but he also hoped deep down that the children could stir something in her, something that would break down the wall of sorrow that had kept them apart for so long. "Who?" Lauren began to speak, her voice broken, as if it were the first time in days that she had tried to form a coherent sentence. "I found them on the street, in the rain," William explained, unsure how to convey everything that had happened. "They were alone. I couldn't leave them." Lauren looked at the babies, then at Michael, who had stayed behind William, hiding in his shadow. There was a moment of tense silence. Then, something in Lauren's expression changed, as if a spark of life briefly flickered in her eyes. She slowly rose from the bed, as if her body had forgotten how to move. She approached the babies, reaching out a trembling hand toward one of them. "They're so cold," she said in a voice barely audible, touching the tiny hand of one of the twins. William felt a lump rise in his throat. For the first time in months, Lauren was interacting with the world around her. She wasn't the woman he once knew, the strong and loving wife he had married, but at least it was a start. "I'll take care of them," Lauren said, more to herself than to William, as if that was the only truth she could cling to at that moment. William watched in silence. He knew this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Something inside him told him that these children hadn't just entered their lives by chance. There was a purpose behind it all, and he was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. Dawn brought a slight calm after the storm of the previous night. The sky cleared, but the atmosphere inside William's home remained heavy. Lauren sat in the living room, with the two babies in her arms, her movements slow and almost uncertain. But it had been months since he had seen her interact like this, so close to other human beings. William watched from the kitchen, not daring to intervene. He knew that any misplaced word or gesture could send her back into the darkness she had been trapped in since their son's death. But he also felt a small spark of hope, watching her engage with the little ones. Lauren, before the tragedy, had been a devoted mother. Her life revolved around the well-being of their son, and that maternal instinct still seemed to be there, buried beneath layers of pain. Although her face bore the invisible scars of her loss, her hands moved delicately as she tended to the twins. William approached cautiously and sat down beside her on the sofa. "They need care," he said softly. "I don't know how to handle this, Lauren. You always were the best at taking care of little ones. I don't want to pressure you, but they need you." Lauren slowly lifted her gaze, her eyes still dim, but with a different glint, a struggle she hadn't shown in a long time. The twins slept soundly, wrapped in the blankets he had found at home, and for the first time in months, the shadow of the Lauren he knew seemed to peek through. "I don't know if I can—" Her voice sounded broken, as if forming words was a challenge. Not after what happened. William didn't interrupt her. He knew it was a delicate subject, that anything he said had to be carefully considered. Instead, he gently took her hand. "We're not replacing anyone," he murmured. "These kids are alone. They're suffering, and you're the only person who can help them right now. They need someone like you." Lauren took a deep breath. Her eyes filled with tears for a moment, but she didn't let them fall. She looked back at the babies, their tiny, fragile bodies cuddled against her, and something seemed to break within the wall of pain surrounding her. She nodded slightly, as if finally accepting what William was asking of her. "I'll do what I can," she whispered, her voice barely a thread. William embraced her briefly, knowing those words meant more than she understood. Her maternal instinct was slowly but surely returning. That would be the first step toward possible healing, not just for the children, but for them as a couple. While Lauren tended to the babies, William focused on Michael. The boy, who had been mostly silent, observed everything from a corner of the room. It was clear he was still scared and disoriented. William knew he had to earn his trust, but he also knew that would take time. He sat down in front of him, keeping a respectful distance. "Are you hungry?" William asked. Michael shook his head, but his stomach let out a soft growl, betraying him. William smiled gently. "I'm going to make you something. You don't have to talk if you don't want to, but I'll be here if you decide to." William got up and went to the kitchen, where he prepared a simple plate. He knew hunger would eventually draw the boy closer. As he waited, he reflected on everything Michael had shared the night before. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but what he was discovering troubled him deeply. When he returned with the plate, Michael was watching Lauren as she cared for the babies. There was something in his expression that William couldn't quite identify at first, a mix of longing and fear. He knew Michael had been through something terrible at the orphanage, and that those scars might never fully heal, but he had to try. "Here you go," he said, placing the plate in front of him. Michael looked at the food for a moment before taking a bite. William remained silent, sitting still and letting the boy take his time. After several minutes, Michael set down the fork and finally lifted his gaze. "She hit us, the director," he whispered. William felt a pang in his chest, but kept his face from revealing the horror those words brought. He leaned slightly forward, not interrupting. "Hannah," Michael continued. "She was in charge of the orphanage. She told us we weren't good, that no one wanted us, and then she left us there. She said not to come back." The boy's words were harsh, almost inhuman. William felt anger rising within him, but he forced himself to remain calm for Michael's sake. He knew the last thing the boy needed was to see an adult lose control. "I'm sorry, Michael," William said firmly. "You shouldn't have gone through that. No one should." Michael nodded slowly, as if William's words offered him a small comfort. But there was still so much more to uncover. The orphanage wasn't just a neglected place. It was where children were mistreated and abandoned. That reality weighed on William more than he had imagined when he first saw Michael on the street. Days passed, and William gradually continued to earn Michael's trust. The boy began to open up, albeit at his own pace. He shared more details about Hannah, the cruel director who had ruled the orphanage with an iron hand, and how she had decided to get rid of them for no apparent reason. Each story was more disturbing than the last, and with every word, William felt a growing urgency to do something. He couldn't just stand by while other children might be suffering the same fate. Lauren also seemed to be awakening from her lethargy. The twins became her main focus. She cared for them with a devotion that William hadn't seen in months. Despite her own pain, there was something about those babies that seemed to restore a part of her. She was no longer completely lost in her sorrow, and although the process was slow, William could see a light at the end of the tunnel. One afternoon, while Lauren fed the babies and Michael quietly played on the floor, William sat down in front of her. "I'm going to investigate more about the orphanage," he said firmly. "Something very dark is going on there, and I can't just leave it like this." Lauren looked at him for a moment, a mixture of concern and understanding on her face. "Just promise me you'll be safe," she said softly. William nodded. He knew what he was about to face wouldn't be easy, but he had made a promise, and he, more than anyone, understood the value of a promise made from the heart. William couldn't stop thinking about what Michael had told him. Every time he tried to rest or focus on a task around the house, the boy's words echoed in his mind. There was something rotten at the heart of that orphanage, and he knew it. As a police officer, William couldn't simply ignore what he was uncovering. But he had to proceed with caution. Hannah, the director, seemed accustomed to superficial investigations and quick excuses. If he was going to help those children, he needed to do it discreetly. He spent the early hours of the morning, before his official shift began, researching what he could about the children's refuge. Using his contacts and access to police files, he began to uncover small details that, taken individually, might have gone unnoticed, but when viewed together painted a disturbing picture. The orphanage had existed for decades, but in recent years there had been a series of strange disappearances. Children who were never seen again, with vague explanations provided by the director. In most cases, Hannah claimed the minors had been adopted by families from other cities, but there were no official records of those adoptions. The documents she should have submitted were incomplete, and in other instances, simply non-existent. William frowned as he read the reports at his desk. Hannah had found ways to evade suspicion for years, and the authorities seemed to have conveniently ignored the inconsistencies, but now he had a reason to keep digging. During those days, as his investigations progressed, William also noticed changes in his home. Lauren So, who had been trapped in her grief since the death of their son, was beginning to show signs of recovery, even if subtle. The twins had become the center of her attention, and her maternal love, which had been hidden for so long, was starting to resurface. One afternoon, while Lauren was feeding them, William stood observing her from the entrance of the living room. Her face, though still marked by sadness, held a serenity he hadn't seen in a long time. The way she cradled the babies, with tenderness and care, reminded him of those early days after their son was born, when everything was joy and hope. Lauren noticed his presence and looked up at him. She said nothing, but her eyes spoke volumes. William knew that she was still grappling with her pain, but now she seemed to find purpose in the tiny beings that depended completely on her. "They're growing fast," Lauren said with a faint smile, something he hadn't seen on her face for months. William nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. As he watched her interact with the twins, he couldn't shake the thoughts of the children who had gone missing from the orphanage. Where were they? What had really happened to them? He knew he couldn't just stand by. "Lauren, I need to tell you something," William finally said, breaking the silence. She looked at him with curiosity, leaving the sleeping babies in their makeshift cribs in the living room. "I've been investigating the orphanage," William began, rubbing his hands together. "There's something off about that place. Several children have disappeared without a trace, and I don't think it's just a coincidence." Lauren frowned, her face hardening slightly. "What does that mean, William?" she asked quietly, concern evident in her voice. William moved closer and sat down beside her. "I don't know for sure yet, but Hannah, the director, something isn't right. The documents are incomplete, and the stories don't add up. I've talked to some colleagues at the station, and there are rumors, but no one has done anything about it. It's as if she has a way of dodging the questions." Lauren stared at him, processing his words. Although she was regaining her strength, she wasn't fully prepared to face more horrors. But William knew she had a right to know what was happening, especially since those children were now a part of their lives. "Do you think the babies could have—" Lauren left the sentence hanging, her voice trembling slightly. William shook his head. "I don't know, but I can't risk doing nothing. I need to keep investigating. If there are more kids in danger, we have to do something. I can't get this out of my mind." Lauren nodded slowly, their hands intertwined, and for a moment they both fell silent, lost in their thoughts. William knew he was taking a risk by continuing his investigation. If he rushed things, he might alert Hannah, and she could make the children disappear just like the others had. But he felt he had no choice. As the days passed, the pieces began to fit together. William obtained the names of some of the children who were supposedly adopted and started tracing the families. One by one, the stories crumbled. The addresses were fake, the contacts non-existent. Each new discovery fueled his anger and determination. This was much more than simple negligence. Something far more sinister was at play. Meanwhile, at home, the bond between Lauren and the twins was strengthening. The daily routine of caring for them gave her purpose, a reason to get up in the mornings. Although she still had dark days, those moments of despair seemed to be happening less frequently. Even Michael, who remained reserved, began to open up more. There were days when she found him playing quietly in the backyard, his little body finally relaxed for the first time in a long while. One evening, while Lauren was preparing dinner and Michael played with some toys, William couldn't help but smile at the scene. Their home, once filled with sadness and silence, now had flickers of life. He couldn't deny that the arrival of those children had started to heal the wounds that tragedy had left on their family. However, the investigation didn't stop. William knew he was treading dangerous ground, and the more he uncovered, the more urgent the matter became. The puzzle pieces were aligning, and the image they formed was unsettling. He couldn't afford to make mistakes, not when children were involved. One afternoon, while reviewing some documents at the station, his colleague Dave approached him, a look of concern etched on his face. "William, are you sure about what you're doing?" Dave asked. "That orphanage? I've heard things, but no one has been able to prove anything. If you keep pushing, you could get yourself in trouble." William looked at him intently, aware of the risks. "I can't ignore this, Dave. Not after what I've seen. Not after what those children have experienced." Dave nodded, understanding. "Just be careful. There are things that could go wrong if you're not prepared." William knew his friend was right, but he also knew he was willing to risk everything to protect those kids. The rain tapped softly against the window of Commissioner Jack's small office, filling the space with a monotonous sound that contrasted with the intensity of the conversation unfolding inside. William sat across from his old friend and colleague, Commissioner Jack. The table between them felt like an invisible barrier, but the topic that united them was much stronger than any formalities. Jack, frowning, ran his fingers over the folder William had handed him moments before. "You know this isn't simple, William," Jack said, looking directly into his friend's eyes. "Hannah has friends in high places. If we go after her without solid evidence, we might lose our careers, and something more." William didn't look away, his face serious and determined. He understood what he was up against, but he had come too far to turn back now. The names of the missing children, the lies about non-existent adoptions, the horrors Michael had described. He couldn't look the other way. "I can't let this continue, Jack. There are more kids out there who could be in danger. I can't allow what happened to Michael and the twins to happen again, not after everything we've uncovered," William replied, his voice deep but resolute. Jack sighed and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling for a moment. He knew William was right. The weight of the decision fell on both of them, but he had to consider all the implications. "If we do this," Jack said, leaning forward, "we can't make mistakes. One slip-up and Hannah will slip away just like she has before. If that happens, we'll not only lose the children, but there could be repercussions. She has influential friends. You know that as well as I do." William nodded. He was aware of what was at stake, but he also knew he couldn't remain passive. He had seen too much, heard too much. The pain in Michael's eyes, the state of the twins when he found them. Everything reminded him of his own suffering and what he had lost. "Jack, I can't live knowing those kids are suffering and that I did nothing. If this goes wrong, so be it." "But I'm not going to stand by," William said, his voice firmer than it had sounded in weeks. "These kids, they are the only thing keeping me going right now." The commissioner looked at William intently. He had known him for years and could see the controlled desperation in his words. He himself had heard rumors about the children's refuge, but without solid evidence, it was nearly impossible to act. However, Michael's testimony and the inconsistencies William had uncovered were the closest thing they had to a solid lead in a long time. Finally, Jack nodded, making a decision. "All right, William, we'll do it, but we're doing it my way. If we're going to expose Hannah, we need to build a case that's airtight. We can't go in with half-baked evidence, or we'll see her walk free in a matter of hours." William felt immediate relief, but he also knew this was just the beginning. Jack was right. They had to be careful and precise. They couldn't afford mistakes. "Thank you, Jack," William said. "You won't regret this." Jack offered a slight smile, but the weight of the situation still hung over them. "Toys, don't thank me yet," Jack said. "First, we have to start moving the pieces, and I need you to keep a low profile. If Hannah suspects anything before we're all set, we might lose her for good." William understood the warning. The key here was patience. If they moved too quickly, they would alert Hannah, but if they waited too long, more children could disappear or suffer under her control. The situation was a tightrope, and both of them knew it. Over the next few days, William and Jack began to meticulously plan their approach. The goal was to enter the orphanage legally, obtain solid evidence that could hold up in an official investigation. The strategy was clear. First, gather statements from former employees or residents of the orphanage who could corroborate Michael's claims. Then, obtain a search warrant that would allow them to comb through the orphanage's records, hoping to find evidence of disappearances and abuse. Jack contacted some of his trusted colleagues, officers who could help without raising suspicion. Among them was Sarah, an investigator who had worked on child abuse cases before. She joined the team enthusiastically, outraged by what she had heard about the orphanage. Meanwhile, William had a crucial mission of his own, protecting his family. He couldn't allow his investigation to put Lauren, Michael, or the twins in danger. He knew that if Hannah felt cornered, she might resort to any measures to avoid being discovered. The thought of someone harming them tormented him. One night, while Lauren was putting the twins to bed, William stayed alone in the living room, going over the documents he had obtained. His mind was filled with possibilities about what he might find in that place. But he also knew that his life would never be the same after this. Lauren entered the living room and sat beside him, looking at the papers spread out on the table. Though she hadn't been directly involved in the investigation, she knew exactly what was going on. Her expression showed concern, but also an acceptance of the situation. "Are you sure this is the right thing to do?" she asked softly, breaking the silence. William looked into her eyes, taking her hand. "I can't let this continue, Lauren. These kids, they have no one else. We can't allow more innocent lives to go through what they've already suffered." Lauren nodded slowly, understanding. She had begun to feel a deep connection with the twins, and the idea that other children might be in danger filled her with a mix of sadness and rage. "Just promise me you'll be careful," she said, her voice trembling slightly. William hugged her, feeling the weight of his promise. He couldn't guarantee that everything would turn out well, but he would do everything in his power to protect his family and the children at risk. He had no other choice. This was his fight now. The days of investigation had been exhausting, both mentally and emotionally, but nothing William had uncovered so far had prepared him for what he was about to unearth. What initially seemed like a case of child abuse at the children's refuge was turning into something much darker and more twisted. As he delved deeper into the files and documents he had gathered, the loose ends began to connect, forming a picture that made his stomach churn with anger. On a cloudy afternoon at the police station, William was in his office, reviewing a stack of documents related to suspicious adoptions. There was something about the pattern of children's disappearances that had been unsettling him for days. But it wasn't until that moment that everything clicked. After hours of sifting through names, dates, and unresolved cases, William saw the connection. The missing children had not been legally adopted. The names of the supposed adoptive families were fake. No official records, no follow-up on the well-being of the minors. All those children had vanished into a bureaucratic black hole. But the most disturbing thing he discovered was Hannah's real business: human trafficking. Using the orphanage as a front, Hannah sold children to families willing to pay to bypass the bureaucracy and scrutiny of the legal adoption process. The children were treated like commodities, their lives ruined by the desires of others to have a child at any cost. William dropped the report he had in his hands, his breath quickening. He felt rage bubbling within him, a fierce heat spreading through his body. Everything he had suspected paled in comparison to what was really happening. It wasn't just abuse, it was human trafficking. And the worst part was that Hannah had been getting away with it for years. He quickly got up from his desk and headed straight to Jack's office. The commissioner was at his desk, reviewing some papers when William burst in without warning. "Jack, we need to act now," William said, his voice laden with contained fury. Jack looked up, surprised by his friend's intensity. "What did you find?" he asked, closing the papers in front of him. William threw the documents he had compiled onto Jack's desk. "It's not just abuse," William said, his voice trembling with indignation. "Hannah is trafficking children. She's selling them to families willing to pay enough. The adoptions are fake. There's no trace of the children after they leave the orphanage. Everything is covered up. But here are the names, the dates, enough to justify an immediate intervention." Jack's face hardened as he read the documents. What had begun as an investigation into abuse at the orphanage had now turned into a nightmare of much greater proportions. Jack ran a hand through his hair, clearly worried, but also knowing they could not waste any more time. "This changes everything," Jack finally said, lifting his gaze. "We need to act before she finds out we're investigating her. If she suspects anything, she'll vanish and we won't catch her. William nodded, knowing that the chance to save more children hung by a thread. I know, Jack, but we can't wait. If she flees, not only will we lose the opportunity to stop her, but more children might disappear. They've suffered too much already, William said, clenching his fists. Jack sighed, knowing he was right. Without further delay, he began organizing an operation to raid the orphanage. But they knew that Hannah, with her connections, might find out if they didn't act quickly and discreetly. Jack called together a team of trusted officers, those who couldn't be bought or intimidated. He knew that not everyone on the force was immune to the influences of money and Hannah's power. As the operation was being prepared, William returned home, knowing that night would be crucial. When he entered, he found Lauren in the living room, curled up with the twins, who were starting to babble some words. Michael was sitting on the floor, playing with building blocks. He seemed calmer these days, though William knew the trauma he had endured wouldn't disappear so easily. Lauren looked at him as he entered, and immediately noticed the tension in his expression. "What happened?" she asked softly, setting one of the twins down in the crib and walking over to William. William took a moment to catch his breath. He knew that what he was about to tell Lauren would deeply affect her. Hannah wasn't just abusing the children, he said, carefully choosing his words. She's involved in something much worse. She's selling the children, trafficking them. Lauren paled at those words, her eyes filled with disbelief and horror. "How is that possible?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How can someone do something so inhumane?" William moved closer and took her hand. "I don't know, Lauren. I can't understand it. But we're stopping it. Tomorrow we'll raid the orphanage. We can't wait any longer." Lauren nodded, but the shock was still visible on her face. She stroked the head of one of the twins, who was happily babbling, oblivious to the danger they had escaped from. "Why were Michael and the twins abandoned?" Lauren asked, as if trying to make sense of what had happened. William had been thinking about that since he discovered the truth, and now it all made sense. "Michael and the twins weren't valuable enough for her," William explained, feeling the words burn in his throat. "Michael is older, and the families that bought children wanted babies or toddlers. And the twins, well, they're black. To her, they weren't valuable merchandise, so she left them. She abandoned them on the street because she didn't consider them useful." The silence that followed was dense and painful. Lauren couldn't take her eyes off the little ones, and William felt an uncontrollable rage at the thought of how those children had been treated like disposable objects. "I can't believe someone could do something so terrible," Lauren said softly, tears rolling down her cheeks. William hugged her tightly. He knew he wouldn't sleep that night, but he was determined to bring justice for those children, for Michael, for the twins, and for all those who had disappeared under Hannah's grasp. "I'm going to stop her, Lauren. I promise," William said, with a controlled fury in his voice. The operation was underway, and by dawn, everything would change. The day of the raid arrived sooner than William had anticipated. The tension in the air was palpable as the police officers, led by Jack, prepared to enter the orphanage. The patrol lights flashed in the morning mist, creating an unsettling contrast with the eerie silence surrounding the children's refuge. William stood at the front, his heart racing. Though his mind was focused on the mission, he couldn't help but think of Michael's face and the twins, of the children still trapped inside. Jack approached William before giving the signal for the team to move. "This is our only chance, William. We need to do this quickly and precisely. Hannah won't have time to react if everything goes as planned." William nodded, his gaze fixed on the orphanage's main entrance. He knew they were about to confront something dark, but he wasn't prepared for the magnitude of what they would discover. When Jack gave the order, the officers advanced in formation. The front door was smashed down in one blow, and within seconds, the orphanage was surrounded. William entered alongside the team, gun in hand, though his goal was not combat, but rescuing the children who had been suffering in that place. Inside, the orphanage was even worse than what Michael had described. The walls were filthy, the air heavy and dense, and the silence was unsettling. The officers searched the premises, opening doors and discovering rooms filled with disheveled beds and broken toys. But what impacted William the most was the state of the children they found. In one of the larger rooms, they found several young children huddled together in deplorable conditions. Some were malnourished, others trembling with fear, their faces marked by abandonment. Their gazes were vacant, as if they had lost all hope of being rescued. William felt a lump in his throat upon seeing the youngest ones, some no older than 3 or 4 years, who would probably have been next in line to be sold. One of the officers approached William. "We found most of the children in the back of the building, separated from the others, just as you said." William quickly headed toward that section of the orphanage, his heart pounding hard. He knew the moment of truth had arrived. In that area, the police team found a small group of younger children ready to be sold, locked away in makeshift cells. The conditions were terrifying, and William felt a wave of rage wash over him at the cold indifference with which they had been treated. Suddenly, one of the officers shouted down the hallway, "Hannah is trying to escape." William ran toward the source of the voice. Hannah, the director of the orphanage, had seized the chaos of the raid to attempt an escape through a back exit. With her disheveled expression and trembling hands, the woman who had been at the helm of so much suffering no longer resembled the powerful and controlling figure everyone had talked about. Now, she was just a desperate criminal. Jack and other officers intercepted her before she could reach the edge of the premises. With wide eyes and ragged breathing, Hannah screamed in vain, trying to deny everything that the raid had revealed. "You don't know what you're doing. This is a misunderstanding," she shouted as the officers handcuffed her. William watched from a distance, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. Finally, the woman who had shattered so many lives had fallen, but he couldn't ignore the number of children who had suffered before they could stop her. Children like Michael, who had been discarded like worthless objects, or the twins, who had been abandoned simply for not being the right merchandise. Hannah was quickly taken to a patrol car, her screams fading as the vehicle's door closed. William stood still for a moment, watching how the scene unfolded around him. Officers were extracting children from the building, escorting them to safety while paramedics assessed their conditions. He knew he had accomplished what he set out to do, that he had stopped Hannah and dismantled the child trafficking network. But the sense of relief was tinged with profound sadness. The next day, during the trial, Hannah's case was laid bare in all its brutality. The evidence was overwhelming: forged documents, testimonies from former employees who had finally broken their silence, and, of course, the heart-wrenching stories of the children who survived the orphanage. The truth that emerged was devastating. Hannah had run a child trafficking ring for years, exploiting the vulnerability of children without families, selling them in exchange for money to families looking to circumvent the legal adoption process. William was present in the courtroom, silently observing as Hannah's every crime was detailed. The testimonies were hard to hear, but it was necessary for the truth to be revealed. Finally, after days of trial, Hannah was sentenced to a long prison term, a punishment that would never be enough to repair the damage she had caused, but at least would ensure she could no longer harm any more children. As he left the courthouse, William felt a mix of emotions. He had achieved justice, but the cost had been high. He knew that those children, although now safe, would carry the scars of their mistreatment for the rest of their lives. When he arrived home that afternoon, Lauren was waiting for him in the living room with Michael and the twins. The older boy looked at him, instinctively knowing that everything was over. William knelt in front of him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Hannah can't hurt anyone anymore," he said softly. Michael nodded, his serious face showing a glimmer of relief in his eyes. "What about the other kids?" he asked, always concerned for others. William smiled sadly, but with the certainty that, at least for now, those children were safe. "They're safe. They're getting help, just like you." As the twins played on the floor and Lauren watched them, William felt a strange peace. He knew that his struggle was not over. There would still be many difficult moments, both for him and for the children who had survived that hell, but for the first time in a long while, he felt he had done the right thing, that he had been able to protect those who needed it most. He had put an end to a network of suffering, but the road to healing for both the children and himself was just beginning. The soft sound of children's laughter filled the house, something that had been absent for so long. William watched from the kitchen door, coffee cup in hand, as Michael played with the twins in the living room, Lauren sitting on the floor with them. smiled with a joy he hadn't seen in years. The darkness that had enveloped their home since the death of their son seemed to have dissipated, giving way to a new light, a hope neither he nor Lauren had thought possible. The chaos of the past few weeks had left deep scars, but it had also given them a new chance, a new family. What began as a duty for William, finding those 3 abandoned children in the rain, had transformed into something much more powerful. Those children were not just in his care, they had become the center of his life, the possibility of a new beginning. Michael, who had initially been so reserved, was beginning to show more confidence, speaking more often and playing with the twins as if they were his own siblings. The twins, in turn, brought an energy that filled every corner of the house. William couldn't help but smile at how carefree they were, unaware of everything they had endured. Lauren had changed in remarkable ways. The woman who had once been trapped in the abyss of grief had now found a reason to move forward. The pain of losing their son would never disappear, but now she had something more to focus on, something more to pour her love into. The twins and Michael had rescued her from her own emptiness, and William watched this transformation with a mix of relief and gratitude. One afternoon, while the children were sleeping, William and Lauren sat at the kitchen table. The silence between them was no longer tense but filled with a shared peace. William knew they were both thinking the same thing, but it was Lauren who broke the silence. "I've been thinking a lot about what comes next," she said, looking at her teacup with her hands intertwined. "I can't imagine our lives without them, Michael and the twins. They've changed everything for us." William nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. He had been mulling over the same thought for days. The children had come into their lives amid chaos, but they had become the pillar that held them together. He knew what Lauren was suggesting, and he couldn't agree more. "You're right," he finally said, taking Lauren's hand. "They are part of us now. I can't see a future without them. We've been through so much, and we've made it here. I think it's time to make it official." Lauren looked at him, her eyes shining with contained emotion. "Adopt them?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. William smiled, nodding. He had thought about all the implications, the long and complicated legal process, but none of that mattered. He knew they were ready to be the family those children deserved. "Yes," he replied. "I can't imagine our life without them. Michael is already part of this family, and the twins, well, they're like our own kids. I can't explain it, but I feel that this is what we need to do." Lauren leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. They both fell silent for a moment, processing what that decision meant. The path to adoption wouldn't be easy or quick, but they knew it was the next logical step. The children were no longer just temporary responsibilities, they were family. As the days passed, they began researching the adoption process. It wasn't a simple undertaking. Despite William being a police officer, the bureaucracies of the system were relentless, and the orphanage's history complicated the situation even more. The forged documents and the trafficking ring they had dismantled left a trail of legal complications, but that didn't stop them. Both William and Lauren were determined to do whatever it took to formalize what they already felt in their hearts, that Michael and the twins were their children. The paperwork officially began weeks after the raid. The process was long and exhausting. The interviews, the evaluations, the constant reminders of what had happened in the orphanage. Each step of the way reminded them how close those children had come to losing everything, but it also reinforced their resolve to fight for them. Michael, although still dealing with his own trauma, was adapting more and more to his new life. There were moments when he isolated himself, when the weight of what he had experienced would come crashing down on him again. But William and Lauren were always there, ready to offer the support and love he so desperately needed. The twins, on the other hand, were growing quickly. They were still too young to understand what had happened, but they had adapted perfectly to their new life. Lauren took care of them with a dedication that William hadn't seen since the early years of his own son's life. Seeing her so devoted gave him hope that the future would be better than he had ever imagined. The courtroom was silent, except for the occasional whisper from those present and the soft murmurs of the twins, who were fidgeting in Lauren's arms. Michael sat between William and Lauren, a look of serenity on his face that contrasted sharply with the scared boy William had found under the rain months ago. Today was the day everything would change definitively. The adoption, which had been a long and obstacle-filled journey, was about to become official. William took a deep breath, his heart beating steadily yet strongly. He had faced tense situations in his career as a police officer, but nothing had prepared him for the emotion he felt in that moment. He had fought for this new family with everything he had, and now, the future that had seemed so uncertain was beginning to take shape. The judge, an older man with a kind expression, reviewed the final documents. He had witnessed many adoptions, but something about this family felt special. He lifted his gaze to William, Lauren, Michael, and the twins, and a small smile appeared on his face before he began to speak. "Today, we make official something that is already clear to everyone," the judge said, his words echoing in the small room. "This family has been through a lot, and it's evident that these children have a home filled with love and protection. There is no doubt that they have found their place of their family." William felt tears welling up in his eyes, but he forced himself to maintain his composure. He knew this was a moment they would always remember. Lauren, sitting beside him, was silent, but he noticed she was fighting back tears. Holding one of the twins, she looked at Michael with a mixture of pride and emotion. The judge signed the documents with a firm gesture and raised his gaze. "William and Lauren Parker, from this day forth, Michael, Austin, and Jacob are officially your children. I wish you all the best in this new chapter of your lives." The sound of the judge's seal on the paper felt like the final stroke of a hammer, sealing their fate as a family. In that moment, William felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years. The pain of losing his biological son, a pain that would always be there in some way, now coexisted with something much larger, the love and responsibility of a new family. He wasn't replacing what he had lost, but he had found a way to heal, to move forward. And he had done it not just for himself, but for the 3 children who had entered his life under the most unexpected circumstances. Michael looked at William with an expression that conveyed more than words could express. He had gone from being a broken child full of fear to a young boy who finally felt like he belonged somewhere. During the months they had shared, William had watched as that little boy with a heart full of scars began to trust, to open up, to laugh again. As they rose from their seats, ready to leave the courtroom, Michael gently tugged at William's sleeve. The gesture made William lean down toward him. What came next surprised and deeply moved him. "Thank you for everything, Dad," Michael said with a sincerity that pierced through William's defenses. The word "Dad" hit him like a surge of emotions. Until that moment, Michael had shown affection,